Welcome to the first in a series of events called Sofa Science, being run by Aston University. These events are going to take place over the next 2 weeks, where academics and researchers from Aston University will be explaining some of the research, some of the science and technology that they work in and that they teach to you watching via Facebook Live. So just to introduce myself, I'm Dr. James Brown. I'm an associate professor within the Department of Biosciences in the School of Life and Health Sciences at Aston University. And this evening I'm going to talk to you about fat cells. The proper name for fat cells is adipocytes, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about how adipocytes contribute towards normal health and disease. Now, it's really important to start off by saying that this talk and any discussion about body fat should not demonize the way people look. Body fat is actually essential for health. The adipose tissue or fat tissue we have in our body has a number of functions which are physiological and also functions which are very important to maintaining our normal everyday health. I'll give you some examples. So you're able to regulate your temperature, particularly on a cold day, partly because your body fat insulates you against heat loss. Separately, most of you are probably sat down, as I am now. I'm on quite a firm chair, and that chair is relatively comfortable, partly because of the adipose tissue I've got around my bum, which makes sure that I'm not pressing hard hip and pelvis bones against the wood of the chair. And importantly, and I'll come to this a little bit later, our body fat stores also release lots of different chemicals, including hormones, that have an important role in appetite, in reproduction, and in mood, as well as being a site for the conversion of different hormones where we can produce things like estrogen from a hormone like testosterone. So it's really important to remember that never demonize body fat. It's a very important tissue, an essential tissue. But in some cases, when an individual gets too much adipose tissue or too much fat, it can cause issues. So if we look at body fat historically, many people think that really we've only seen issues like obesity in the last 50 years or so, but it's not true. If you look back through art and culture, you'll see statues and paintings and depictions of people with obesity from thousands of years ago. And equally, the very earliest of medical texts, like the Ebers Papyrus, and reports from Ayurvedic doctors in Southeast Asia, such as Shushrut and Charak, they spoke about patients having obesity and how they prescribed things like wrestling and elephant rides for people with obesity, which I'm pretty sure is not available on the NHS today. So it's been a condition that is associated with human beings for a very long time. However, if you look at the last 50 years, particularly in the UK and in many developed nations, we've seen an explosion of obesity. Back in about 1966, when Aston University received its charter, we would have had about 2 or 3% of the adult population being classed as having obesity. Nowadays, just over 50 years later, and it's around 27-28% of the adult population are obese, and overall, across the population, more than 66%, more than 2/3 of the population are overweight. So what's happened in the last 50 years that's caused this explosion in overweightness and obesity? There are lots of different factors, and it's not simple, and I really can't solve it this evening, but I will point you towards a couple of issues. The first is food. So our diet has changed more in the last 50 years than it did in the 500 years before that. If you look at the availability of food, if you look at the energy density or the calories contained in food, it's dramatically changed. So we've gone from a situation where food was relatively scarce unless you were wealthy, to a situation where almost everybody can afford to eat 24 hours a day and eat food in large portions with lots of calories. And that will definitely have an impact on our levels of body fat. Separately, we're a very ingenious species, and we've invented lots of very useful time-saving and time-wasting technology in the last 50 to 100 years. You're using some of that technology now, whether you're watching on a phone or a tablet or a laptop. These inventions have reduced the need for us to move around, reduced the need for physical activity. Everything from the car to the washing machine and the dishwasher to having lifts and escalators at a shopping centre means we move about less. And if you combine those two things, more energy available in our diet, less energy being expended as we move about during the day. That's one of the reasons, and probably one of the key reasons, that we've started to see increased levels of obesity. Now, the tissue that's important in obesity is adipose tissue or fat tissue, and the predominant cell found within our fat tissue is the adipocyte or fat cell. And I'm going to talk a little bit now about why it is these adipocytes end up contributing towards obesity, and to do that I'm going to use as a model one of these, a balloon. Now, this is actually a pretty accurate model of an adipocyte, other than the fact that it's much larger. Most of you, particularly those of you that are over the age of 20 or so, will probably have about 30 billion of these adipocytes dotted around your body, and that's the average person. So people with smaller or larger waistlines might have fewer or more adipocytes. And these adipocytes can increase in size, or volume rather, by 1,000-fold from an empty adipocyte, which you can see here, to a full one, which I'll give you a demonstration of. Like that. So this is why they're a good model. You can see that the gigantic increase in volume of this balloon mirrors the increase in size or volume of an adipocyte when an individual is exposed to lots of energy. Excuse what I'm going to have to do now. Okay. So, how is it that these adipocytes and our diet and exercise have led to us becoming very obese, and why is it that obesity is bad for us? So first of all, it's important to note that the number of adipocytes that we have stays relatively stable above the age of 20 or so. So in general, you don't make new adipocytes if you gain weight. If you, as I do occasionally, go through a cycle of eating more food and not exercising and gain a bit of weight, that weight gain won't be due to you making new adipocytes. It'll be due to the existing adipocytes that you've got getting bigger. So again, a little bit like this. So let's say that's a normal healthy adipocyte, and over a period of a few months I start to eat much more of the chocolate that's literally just in the fun cupboard over there, and I don't exercise as much, and then gradually what happens is the adipocytes get bigger and bigger. Now this is something which the body can cope with pretty well. It can cope with adipocytes increasing in size and decreasing in size quite well. If anyone's got any questions, by the way, about this, make sure you send them through through the comments section on Facebook, and I'm happy to answer them after the main talk. What happens, though, unfortunately, is in some people with obesity, and there are two theories as to why obesity is damaging to us, we reach capacity. And again, we can see this with the balloon. So if I blow this balloon up as large as it will go, now without it popping, I can't get much more air in this balloon, and the adipocytes in your body will have a similar limited capacity for storing what they store. Now they store triglyceride, which is a type of fat or oil, which if you reach into your cupboard and find a bottle of olive oil or vegetable oil, that will be triglyceride, and that's what's inside your fat cells, inside your adipocytes. And what happens in individuals with obesity is their adipocytes become so full with oil that they reach their capacity for storing oil, for storing energy, and that energy has to be stored somewhere else, and it will therefore circulate in the blood and be stored in tissues which aren't designed to store fat, such as the liver, such as the kidneys and the muscle. When those tissues store fat within their cells, it often damages those cells and stops them from doing the normal things that they do. So for example, in the liver, you'll end up having a limited response to insulin, which can drive insulin resistance and cause an increase in type 2 diabetes. Again, apologies in advance because I'm going to empty this balloon. Okay, I can see some questions coming in. That's really good. I'll get to those in a minute. Now, the second theory, so that's called the storage deficit theory of obesity. The second and competing theory, which is where I've done a lot of my research in the early stage of my career, is based around what adipocytes secrete. So, again, I'll blow this balloon up slightly. A healthy size adipocyte that's not too full will release something like 300 to 400 different things. And these things, these chemicals, include proteins such as cytokines and adipokines. These are cell signaling molecules that will bind to receptors in cells and cause them to do different things. Also includes DNA and RNA, so nucleic acids. They can be released in vesicles, and lots of other proteins and other chemicals. What we know is that when an adipocyte is a normal size, like this, it tends to release a very different secretory soup, if you like, than a very large adipocyte like this. And what we know is that as adipocytes undergo hypertrophy or overgrowth, it makes them release more inflammatory chemicals. And these inflammatory chemicals can start to cause, again, damage to tissues throughout the body. And this is called the adipokine theory of obesity. So I have a question which I'll answer very quickly. How do I get rid of fat cells? It's a really good question. The short answer is through the best way to do this is through a process of reducing your calorie intake and increasing your physical activity. So diet and exercise. It's often difficult for some people to lose weight through diet and exercise, but often it's about doing it for a sustained amount of time in the right way. So combining resistance training and endurance training, so lifting weights and jogging, for example, but most importantly, reducing your calorie intake. There's one final point I want to make about adipocytes. So again, I'm going to have to release the air from this balloon. Fab. One of the things which has been discovered more recently about adipocytes is the fact that if an individual has been obese for a number of years, the tissue that surrounds their adipocytes becomes fibrous, becomes stiff and leathery. What that means is that the adipocytes inside that tissue actually have a limited ability to increase in size. Now, this might sound like a good thing because it means that they won't become overfull. And I'll show you a demonstration of this using a jar. So if you imagine that this is an individual's adipose tissue and they've had obesity for a number of years, if the adipocyte within this fibrous, leathery, stiff tissue that surrounds the adipocytes tries to increase, this is what happens. It gets to a point where it cannot increase anymore because it's encased within a very thick fibrous tissue. Now what that means is that the fat that's normally contained within an adipocyte will definitely then circulate around in the blood and have to be stored somewhere else. So it'll be stored again in the liver, the kidney and the muscle. And it's thought that this fibrosis or stiffening of the tissue that surrounds adipocytes is a really new and exciting target for trying to treat some of the comorbidities of obesity. It's the last time I apologise. I've got to let air out of this balloon. That was a bit of a letdown, to be honest. And that's where I'm going to finish the talk by talking about the comorbidities or the diseases which are associated with obesity. We know that obesity is serious as a condition because individuals that have obesity have a greatly increased risk of getting type 2 diabetes, of getting heart disease, and of getting even some cancers, particularly cancers that are found in the gut, like bowel or bladder cancer. And these are very serious and often life-threatening or lifelong conditions, and therefore obesity is an incredibly important condition for us to try and target. Sadly, we know that most people who become obese will stay obese. The success rates of current therapies, if you don't include surgery, the success rates for current therapies are very poor, with some studies reporting less than 10% of people who become obese successfully reverting back to being non-obese when they go through some kind of lifestyle intervention. And this is why knowing about adipocytes and about how they work in health and in disease is really important. This is the kind of information that you would learn if you were studying on a biological sciences or biomedical science course here at Aston University. We'd learn about it in physiology, in cell biology, in modules like the biological basis of human disease and others. Okay, so hopefully there was something within that 15 minutes which has taught you about adipocytes and how they work and how they, when they don't work, if you like, can contribute towards disease. I'm now going to see if there's any questions coming through. It's been really nice to sit here and talk to you. So, okay, I've got a question. Would you say a bad diet is more of a significant contributor to fat cells than a lack of exercise? Yes, I would. So if you look at particularly what's the most successful way of losing weight, which in the end gives you an indication of how we're gaining weight, then diet is probably the predominant factor. So we know that the best way to lose weight is to combine a reduction in calorie intake with exercise. That's more powerful than diet alone in terms of its ability to reduce fat size or fat mass, and that's more powerful than exercise alone. So if you reverse that, it's likely that the combination of eating too much and not exercising is going to contribute to a gain in fat mass compared to eating too much and doing some exercise, or just eating too much and not doing some exercise. Okay, another question. How does the body shift fat from the tissues or the adipocyte first, and will the adipocyte shrink eventually when you lose weight? It's a really good question. So if we look molecularly down at how an adipocyte does this, if you can imagine an adipocyte, and I'm going to get my balloon back out for this, it's one more chance to blow it up and make some funny noises. So if you imagine this is an adipocyte inside your body, if you were to look at it with a microscope, you would find that it has one absolutely enormous oil droplet or droplet of fat in the middle, which makes up more than 90 or 95% of the volume of that fat cell. It's a huge, big droplet of oil. So these adipocytes in the body are like balloons full of oil. Now, when you go through a period of either reduced calorie intake or increased energy expenditure, such as exercise, and your body needs to utilize energy stores to make sure it can continue doing normal functions, what happens is that enzymes known as lipases, which break down fat, will chip away at that fat droplet around the edges, releasing triglyceride molecules, which can then be exported from the fat cell into the blood, circulate through the blood and go to tissues where they can be used as energy. So we have a molecular mechanism there for moving fat from adipocytes out into the body. The second part of that question was, will adipocytes shrink when you lose weight? Absolutely. They are very, very flexible, if you like, in terms of their size. So again, as you lose weight, it's my last chance, definitely. If you lose weight, then the adipocyte will shrink, like so. And then if, like me, 6 months later, you forget all about all those healthy eating habits that you've got and you gain weight, it will regain in size as well. Like so. So adipocytes will shrink or grow depending on the relative amounts of energy availability in your body. As an add-on to that, and this is quite important, adipocytes don't just increase and decrease in size, some of them do proliferate. So around 8% of the adipocytes in your body will be proliferating at any one time, but they're generally replacing old adipocytes that have died. Absolutely the last time. Now I'm going to let that go. I have one more question. So what would we learn about these sorts of topics, science of fat, diet, health, etc. on Aston courses? You absolutely would. There's a number of Aston courses where this type of information would be taught. I teach in the biosciences department, so both on biological sciences, the masters in biology and biomedical science, and you would learn about lots of different elements of what I've discussed today. So you'd learn about the physiology of energy homeostasis, about how appetite is driven by the brain, and that's what causes you often to eat, and then eating is what leads to nutrients being stored in the body. In cell biology, you would learn about the biology of the adipocyte and the different hormones, enzymes, and other structures associated with fat cells. In final year modules on that course, like the biological basis of human disease, you'd learn about the consequences of obesity. Equally, in the biochemistry degree, you would learn about the enzymes and other structures, proteins, for example, that are important for maintaining the structure and function of an adipocyte. So there are lots of different courses with lots of different modules where this type of information will be covered. Oh, God, that's such a good question. Okay, so I've had a question that's come in that said, what is fat freezing? I saw a video on YouTube, but I didn't really understand it. So fat freezing, the proper name for fat freezing is cryolipolysis. So if you break that word down, it means cryo meaning cold, lipo meaning fat, lysis meaning split. So it's using cold temperature to break down fat cells. Now, actually, if you look at the studies, the scientific reports which have looked at cryolipolysis or fat freezing, it does seem to work to some extent. What that means is that in individuals that have had cryolipolysis, you can see a reduction of about 10 to 20% in the size of an area which has been treated with a very cold temperature. What these beauty salons don't get correct is the mechanism for how cryolipolysis works. They will all tell you that actually fat freezing disrupts and breaks and splits adipocytes, and that you somehow then magically just urinate out all the excess oil, which is not true. It's thought that what happens is if you expose a part of the body to a very cold temperature, that you see an increase in metabolic rate of the cells in that area, and they burn up any energy that's available to maintain temperature. So it's likely that by applying to a cold temperature to the body's fat stores, those local cells will then start to burn up the fat that they contain, to create heat and to generate and maintain temperature in that area. And by burning up the fat that's in there, you see those fat cells or adipocytes get smaller and smaller until you get this 10 to 20% reduction. And what's interesting is that doesn't seem to happen for about 2 to 3 months. So you get treated with something cold, and then about 2 to 3 months later, you see a reduction in size in the area. Okay. I've got a question there which I'm not sure how would an adipocyte does. I'm not sure how to answer that question. Apologies. So I'll just see if any other questions come in. While I'm talking, there's different types of adipose tissue. Now, I've spoken to you today about a type of adipose tissue called white adipose tissue. Now, most of the adipose tissue or fat tissue in your body is made up of white adipocytes. So the balloons that I've been using are a really good model of white adipocytes. They store fat in the form of triglyceride, and then they release that fat when you need it. We also have a type of adipose tissue called brown adipose tissue, and it's called brown adipose tissue because if you actually look at it, if you dissect it out from an animal or a human, you'll see that it's slightly tinged with brown colour. Now, the reason it's brown is this type of adipose tissue has lots of mitochondria in it, and mitochondria are the subcellular components that generate energy. So brown adipose tissue is completely different to white adipose tissue, whereas white adipose tissue stores energy in the way that I've demonstrated today. Brown adipose tissue doesn't really store energy. It doesn't have that big single lipid droplet. It has lots of different oil droplets throughout the cell, and it burns energy to produce heat. So when you were first born and you were a newborn, you wouldn't have yet learned how to shiver. We don't have a shivering adaptation when we're born, but we do have something called non-shivering thermogenesis, and that's what brown fat does. Now, for many years it was thought that adults don't have brown fat and we lose it all when we're young, but there's good evidence now that many adults have reasonable stores of brown fat, and those brown fat stores are an important regulator of our body temperature. The thing is that because we often live in a very well temperature regulated environment, we have central heating, we don't have this need for non-shivering thermogenesis, but we have different types of adipose tissue that do different things. Okay, so a couple more questions. So the question before was, how would an adipocyte die? It's a good question. There are a number of different mechanisms associated with cell death or cell injury. With adipocytes, it could just be that they become, there's a word called senescent. So cells within the human body and within animal bodies have a set number of cell divisions they can go through. When they get to the end of these set number of cell divisions, known as the Hayflick limit, they stop dividing and they just sit there. And in a healthy individual with a healthy immune system, your immune system would be able to identify that senescent or aged cell and remove it. So part of that replenishment of adipocytes in fat tissue is down to getting rid of old or damaged adipocytes. Okay, so another question. People who don't gain weight no matter what they eat, do they not have any adipocytes? That's again a really, really good question. Actually, they do have adipocytes. If you, after this session, can Google Lizzie Velasquez. Lizzie Velasquez is an American woman. She's an absolute hero of mine. She was born with a genetic mutation, which means she cannot produce fat tissue. She doesn't have any adipocytes. And if you look at her appearance, this is a form of progeria, or rapid aging. So she looks much older than she is. I think she's about 26 or 27 now, but she looks much older. And again, to identify or to highlight the physiological or health based elements of the function of adipose tissue, Lizzie Velasquez has to eat about 9,000 calories a day just to maintain her body temperature. So that gives you an indication about how much heat you lose if you don't have adipose tissue. But even if you're one of those people, really annoying people, that can eat everything you want and never even gain a pound, I'm in the other camp. If I look at a chocolate bar, I instantly gain half a kilo. But those people, yes, they do have adipocytes. It's not yet fully understood why people like that don't gain weight, but I know that individuals at some of the leading centres in Oxford and Cambridge in the UK are studying thin people who don't tend to gain weight to try and understand that. Another question has come in: can we develop brown adipocytes later in life? Oh, controversial. Okay, so there's actually a third type of adipocyte, and that third type of adipocyte is known as a beige or bright adipocyte. So what we know is, and there is lots of controversy in science about this, it's the kind of thing that you can really get into trouble for on social media if you pick one or another position. But there is evidence in animals and in humans that you can take a white adipocyte and convert it to a brown-like adipocyte or beige adipocyte. Scientists have no imagination, so if one's white and one's brown, the one in the middle is called beige. These beige adipocytes have been shown in a number of studies to be functional at burning off energy as heat. The trigger for them becoming beige is where the controversy is. A few years ago, a paper was published which identified a hormone called irisin, which was believed at the time to cause white adipocytes to become beige adipocytes. However, that's been heavily refuted, so now it's not really clear what the process is, although there are some other hormones which can do this. So it does appear that actually, as an adult, you can, under certain conditions, including cold exposure, you can convert some of your white adipocytes, which is the vast majority, 99.9% of your adipocytes are white. You can convert some of those into brown-like adipocytes or beige adipocytes, which will then burn energy. And this has been really heavily looked at as a potential treatment for obesity, because if you could get people to burn off more energy as heat and not store as much energy, you would see a reduction in fat mass or the amount of adipose tissue, and this would then have a key impact on an individual's risk of becoming obese. Okay, so we may not have any more questions. I'm just waiting to see if there are any more. If not, we are roughly coming up to 7:30, so I'll just wait in case there's any more questions. Okay, yeah, no, there's a question. Does it matter where our body fat is? Again, it's a really interesting question, and yes, it does. So I imagine we will have both females and males watching this talk. I am just about a male, and I tend to store my fat in the typical male storage pattern. This is called the android storage pattern. Now, for a man, that's between the waist and the chest. It's around the trunk, and therefore most men tend to store their fat there. For females, females tend to store their fat in a more what we call a gynoid or female pattern storage, and that is on hips, bums and thighs. What we know from lots of different studies is that it's probably more beneficial to store fat in the female fat storage pattern, so around hips, bums and thighs, than it is the male storage pattern. And we know from studies particularly where women who happen to store their fat around their middle have an increased risk of those comorbidities associated with obesity, so things like type 2 diabetes and heart disease. And it's thought this is why we see more of those we see more of those issues in men, because they store fat in this area. Partly the reason for this is that the fat cells around the middle tend to be slightly larger and therefore more inflammatory. And we also, in the middle of the body, store fat inside the body cavity called visceral fat. It wraps around our organs and tends to be very inflammatory. And therefore storing fat around the middle of the body is much worse than storing fat in other places like lower down on the body. I think that's all we've got time for. So I'd just like to say thank you so much for listening. It's been an absolute pleasure to have half an hour to sit here and talk to you about adipocytes and how they contribute towards health and disease. Hopefully, for those of you that are considering coming to Aston University, it's giving you an indication of some of the types of information you would be taught or you would get to study on some of the courses that we host. So thank you very much.